that. Pick one of the easier ones, probably is ethics. Anyways, so got the recording going. I think we have everyone here, so we can get started. Before we, let's do vote really quick for class next week. So holiday next week. Those who want to skip next week, raise your hand. Okay, that's a majority. Okay, so we'll skip class next week, just start the week after that. Those of you trying to get credit, we'll figure out what our assignments are at the end of class. Okay, so jumping back into the material now. So, hey. Welcome. You're only 7 minutes late.
It's got to be a new record.
All right. So before we jump into Anaxagoras, we need to reorient ourselves. And these philosophers are always answering Parmenides and Heraclitus. So let's remind ourselves of Parmenides and Heraclitus. Well, going all the way back to Heraclitus, what did Heraclitus say? Not so important what he said, but what later people used him as saying is that change implies a contradiction. When you have change, you have what is becoming what is not, and what is not becoming what is. Right? Change implies a contradiction. Parmenides comes along and says, I agree with you. Remember, Heraclitus says change implies a contradiction, therefore logic doesn't work because change is obvious. Parmenides comes along and says, I agree with you that change implies a contradiction, but logic is obvious, so there can't be change. So the later philosophers are trying to reconcile these two. They're trying to figure out how we can have this universe with change in it, but at the same time we don't have what is becoming what is not and what is not becoming what is. We don't want to mix being and non-being together. And that is what Empedocles was trying to do. Remember, Empedocles is the one we talked about last time. And the thought process is maybe if we get rid of Parmenides' idea that everything is one, and we just allow for there to be multiple things, then we can somehow reconcile these two views. And so they're all called pluralists. So everyone we're talking about today is pluralists, including Empedocles, who we talked about last week. Now remember, Empedocles' approach to the problem, he says, okay, so I'm going to have four stuffs out there, fire, water, earth, and air. And now these are what has always been and always will be. Water never increases in the universe. Water never decreases in the universe. However much water there is out there is how much there always has been and always will be. Same with fire, earth, and air. And so he explains change, not as anything new coming into being, but just combinations, certain combinations of atoms coming together. If I can get he didn't use atoms, elements coming together. If I can get the right combination of earth and water and fire together, then I have something called a bone. And as those elements deteriorate off of the bone slowly goes away. And so nothing new really came into being and nothing really went out of existence. It was just different combinations of what has always been and always will be. Make sense? So that was Empedocles' workaround for this problem, and he thought he had figured this out. Now I finally don't have anything coming into being and anything that already exists going away. And so we can have both logic works and we can introduce change into our universe. So now Anaxagoras is the one coming after Empedocles, and he's going to be critical of Empedocles and answering Empedocles' view. So any questions about Heraclitus, Parmenides, or Empedocles before we jump into Anaxagoras?
Were they all Italian? Or at least of the Italian school?
Heraclitus was in Ephesus, which is over in Asia Minor. Parmenides was Italian. He was from Elea. And then Empedocles was also from Sicily. I can't remember the city. Arcragus, which is on Sicily, so Italy again. And then Anaxagoras,
You're saying Empedocles concluded that logic can still work with change.
That's the whole problem. So Parmenides is saying logic implies that there can't be change. And so from here on out, philosophers are trying to reconcile these two views. So Heraclitus says there's change. Parmenides says no, there's logic. philosophers obviously want both those to be true. They want change and they want there to be logic. The problem is that however they viewed it, it seemed like change implied what is becoming what is not, and what is not becoming what is. Contradiction. So they're trying to explain change without anything actually becoming or going away. So that's why he had his 4 fundamental elements that always exist. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so Anaxagoras now, he's going to be over here from Asia Minor as well, from Clazomenae, I don't know how to pronounce it, but city right there, so another one of these Ionian cities. Now, you'll notice, notice his years here, from 500 BC, so he's born right when the First Persian War started, and then he's 20 during Xerxes' main invasion into Greece. And so the speculation is that actually he was a Persian soldier that marched into Greece, came to Athens, and stayed at Athens at the age of 20. So it might seem weird that he's a Persian soldier who ends up living in Athens, but remember, he's also an Ionian. So he's serving Persia somewhat against his will. So by the time he's 20, he goes to Athens, lives in Athens, and that's where he's going to spend the majority of his life. Give you a sense of his character. He was born into a wealthy or aristocratic family, but seemed to shun his inheritance and any pursuit of wealth, spent most of his time just pursuing knowledge. This gives you a sense of his attitude. When asked why it's better to be born than not to be born, he replied that being born is superior since it enables us to study the heavens and the whole universe. So that's how he thought best to spend his life, in the pursuit of things. So came to Athens in 480 BC, same time that the Persians came, most likely part of the Persian military. And something unique about him, he took very little pride in the city that he was from. Most Greek citizens at this time take a lot of pride in where they're from. We'll notice when we get to Socrates, he took a ton of pride in being an Athenian and had no interest in ever going to another city. Anaxagoras is in the opposite boat. He hardly cared about his city. He viewed himself as a citizen of the universe or a citizen of the world. And then so later in his life, when his hometown was having a lot of political problems, people noticed his indifference to their political problems. That kind of shocked him, so they asked him about it. So when asked why he wasn't concerned with his home, he replied, "I honor her indeed and am deeply concerned for her," meaning the universe. That's what he spends his life in pursuit of understanding. So very little pride in his hometown, something unique to him. Here in Athens, he became relatively prominent. He befriended Pericles. Pericles is the major political figure of Athens during their golden age. Remember, right after the Grecian-Persian Wars, Athens is on its rise to power. As they're taking back cities from Persia, they're joining the Delian League, which Athens is the default leader of since Sparta dropped out. And remember, these cities had to pay fees to Athens, either support Athens by contributing to the fleet or pay for Athens to build a fleet. Athens just accumulates a massive fleet now, so they're by default in charge and they can start doing whatever they want with that. So Athens becomes very, very wealthy, ton of money coming in. Pericles is the most prominent political figure at the time, so he's the one that Athens experiences their golden age under. And close friend of Anaxagoras. Now, if you study Greek history, especially Athens, you'll notice anyone who becomes prominent isn't politically prominent for long. Well, Pericles had pretty good running, but to give you an example, Miltiades, he was the one who led the battle at Marathon, which was a huge upset. He was an absolute hero when he went back to Athens, but within a year he was kicked out of the city. So you have a quick rise and quick fall in Athens as a general rule. And Pericles was no different. He had his rise, he had his political falling out. Anaxagoras, since he was a friend of Pericles, Pericles' political opponents went after Anaxagoras in an attempt to go after Pericles as well, so he was eventually forced to flee Athens for his political affiliations. The excuse that they used, which they used a lot of the time, was just accusing them of not being pious, of not believing in the gods. In particularly, Anaxagoras talked about the sun and the moon as physical substances, not as gods, and so that's how they went after him, accusing him of being an atheist. So he was driven out, and he eventually went to Lampsacus, which is a city back up here, so kind of close to where he's initially from. Spent the rest of his life there. The people here actually loved it when he showed up to the city. Instantly took a liking to him. He became prominent there really quick. And so upon his death, they actually made a little altar for him. They dedicated it to truth and mind. We'll understand why truth and mind in a second when we understand his philosophy. But he also requested that when he died, his death become a holiday for school children. And they honored that, so his death became a holiday that was celebrated in the city annually for some time. Anaxagoras, in his philosophy, he was a student of Anaximenes. Remember, Anaximenes is one that says the all is air. He's the one that has a process of air condensing and rarefying to explain everything. Now, we don't mean he literally was a student of him, because Anaximenes was dead by the time Anaxagoras was born, but that he followed his political teachings. So we'll see a good amount of overlap there. He only wrote one book, and from it we have a little over 20 fragments. And then he is most notable for introducing a distinction between mind and matter into philosophy. So notice prior to him, we have this weird combination of the two, like Anaximenes, for example. He thought that the soul was literally composed of air. So it's still very physical stuff. Thales says that the all is divine, gods are in everything. So there was this connection of physical things and mental things. So Anaxagoras is the first one that's going to make the separation between, no, there's mind and there's matter. So he's the first one to make that distinction, and that's what he's most famous for. And we'll get more into that here in a second. But first, let's start with his natural philosophy. And remember, he's coming right after Empedocles. Empedocles, the four elements, water, fire, earth, air. Now, Empedocles, he thought he finally had this clever way to introduce change into his system without allowing contradictions. So Empedocles thought that he no longer had being. Let's just read what I said here. Empedocles claims that he no longer has being coming from not being, and vice versa, since everything is ultimately just different combinations of the elements, and the elements are eternal and never changing. That's how he thought he got around it. And we'll remember with Empedocles' theory, he also had fundamental properties for his elements. So, for example, fire was viewed as hot and dry, water was cool and wet, similarly for air and earth. So he had his four fundamental elements, and he also had their four fundamental properties. And with those, you could also explain why things feel a certain way. If something feels hotter, it must be because it has more fire in it, or if something feels drier, it must be due to how much fire is in there or how much earth's in there, whatever. So he also had an explanation for some of the qualitative differences that we notice in things. Does that make sense what I'm saying? But Anaxagoras is going to say this isn't good enough. And he's going to say consider something like apples, bananas, hair, flesh, etc. Something that isn't just one of your four elements. Now, according to Empedocles, these are just different combinations of earth, water, air, and fire. But even so, Anaxagoras is going to say, all these things are very different from earth, air, water, and fire. They have very different qualities, tastes, colors, odors, textures, etc. And so something new comes into existence, namely the qualities that make a thing what it is. If we were to talk about what exactly is a banana, how do you talk about a banana without noting its particular taste, its particular texture, its particular smell? So Empedocles is over here saying, look, if you get the right combination of water, fire, earth, and air, you got something that's a banana. And Anaxagoras is saying, okay, but what about the banana taste? Was the banana taste in the air? No. Was it in the earth? Was it in the water? Was it in the fire? Then where did the banana taste come from? So, and Anaxagoras is saying you still have what is coming from what is not, and what is not coming from what is. You didn't have banana taste in the beginning, and somehow now you have banana taste. You didn't have yellow in the beginning, and now somehow you have the yellow of a banana. You didn't have that smell in the beginning, and now somehow you have that smell. So you haven't solved your problem like you think you have. You still have what is not becoming what is, and what is becoming what is not. Does that make sense, his criticism so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So, obviously, if we're going to be consistent and really not allow what is to become what is not and what is not to become what is, if we're not going to allow new things to come into existence from what they're not, then we're going to need definitely more than just the four elements. So how many elements is Anaxagoras going to have? He's going to have infinitely many elements. And his view is going to be everything always exists forever, including banana stuff. So everything always exists. Everything exists always. So let's read what he says and then we'll make sense of it. All things were together, infinite both in number and in smallness, for the small too was infinite, and when all things were together, none of them could be distinguished for their smallness. For air and ether prevailed over all things, being both of them infinite, for amongst all things these are the greatest, both in quantity and size. So in the beginning, we have everything is all mixed together. And when we say everything, we mean everything. We mean whiteboards, bananas, grapes, apples, everything in existence is all together. And there's a different type of fundamental stuff for each of those things, and they're all mixed together. Now, if you were to be there in the universe at the very beginning and look at it, you'd say it looks like a bunch of air and ether, according to him. Now, he's going to say that even though there's an infinite amount of banana stuff, chair stuff, table stuff in there, there's also an infinite amount of air and ether, but the air and ether are in there they have a higher ratio of being in there. There's more of them in there, even though it's both infinite. It's like the ratio is different. So there's a preponderance of the air and the ether, and so it seems like it's air and ether, even though there's still banana stuff and all the other stuff. So there's an infinite amount of everything in there, and it can be infinitely small, but it's the ratios of the stuff that makes it seem like what it is.
How could that be if it's infinite, if everything's infinite?
So he would say, look how small this is, and it's composed of marker lid stuff, but there's an infinite amount, because you can always divide it in half, divide it in half, divide it in half, divide it in half. So even though there's an infinite amount, it's still small.
But the ratio of that to...
So he would say inside this marker lid, we have bananas, we have oranges, we have clocks, we have swordfish, we have everything. But the ratio of marker lid stuff to everything else is higher.
Okay.
So for every 100 marker lid stuff, there's only one chair stuff.
So the ratio is the distinction that makes it exist.
That gives it its particular qualities.
Qualities, okay.
Yes, that is exactly right. So, since Parmenides does not allow for things to come into being or go away, Anaxagoras starts by saying that in the beginning there was everything. Okay, now we got it covered. Nothing new is going to come into existence, nothing new is going to go away because everything always was. This means that in some sense bananas, fish, swords, and your nose existed in the beginning, but that air and ether are predominant. This means that it seems like only air and ether exist in the beginning, even though everything else is mixed in there. It's just so diluted because of its ratio to all the other stuff that you can't really notice it. So if you were there in the beginning, it looked like a Parmenidean one of just air and ether, this big ball of existence, undifferentiated mass, all right there in the beginning. That's the way it was because everything was perfectly mixed in with everything else. So there was bananas there, but no way for you to detect them because it's so diluted compared to everything else.
Is he saying this stuff is there to make them? Because like
Banana stuff is there.
inventions, like to make things that they came up with.
So,
Is he saying that the stuff's already there to create those things?
yeah, it's hard to know how far he would take this and when he would allow you to create something new from existing components, like a chair is made from wood, where he had just said the wood stuff's there to begin with and you put it in a particular shape. Now, it's natural for us to think about inventions because we exist in a day and age where we expect how we live 100 years from now to be drastically different than how we live now. They exist at a time where how human beings are living now is kind of how they always lived and always will live. There isn't this notion of invent something new. It isn't a very common thing. So it probably wasn't a question that he even pondered.
My big
I don't know.
question was how would you explain like the growth of bananas and stuff?
The growth of bananas. More banana stuff
Just
is
like
getting
in the
inside.
air.
There's mass everywhere. There's no place where there is a mass. Now I got this space of mass right here. Now if I were to start pumping in more banana stuff from its surroundings and pumping out the air stuff somehow, eventually I would get a banana here.
Right, I get that.
And as the other stuff's got
Like magic.
sorted out, all the atoms are there, right? All the stuff's there. It's just the right combination. So I think I talked about that. Okay, so yeah, what something seems like has to do with what did I call it before? Whatever is predominant. I'll try to stick with that word. Whatever is predominant is what makes something seem like what it is. But remember, everything contains everything. Any physical object has some of everything in it, which is why anything can ultimately look like it changes into anything. Everything is in everything. And it's just a ratio that determines what's predominant, which gives it its particular qualities. That's how we're going to go about this. Okay, and so we'll note that a very important part of his philosophy is infinite divisibility. He needs this to work. That way you can fit an infinite amount of stuff into something that doesn't look very infinite in size, like this. So, infinite divisibility. Nor is there a least of what is small, but there is always a smaller. You can divide it infinitely. For it cannot be that what is should cease to be by being cut. How could I have something, split it in two, and then have nothing? That doesn't make sense. Every time I split it in half, I must still have something, the halves of what I split. But there is also always something greater than what is great, and it is equal to the small in amount. They're both infinite, because they can both be infinitely divided. It's just that one looks smaller, one looks bigger. So we have the bigger and the smaller, but there's the same amount of stuff in terms of the number, because they're both infinite. You follow that?
Yeah.
A lot of confusion in concepts here, but hopefully we can make it appeal to the intuition. And so since they're all infinite, then each thing is both great and small.
Where did they come up
And
with the
equal.
conception of infinite? Well, wasn't infinitesimally small like a very modern train of thought? That I have the same amount of pieces in the marker than are in the whole entire universe of pieces of it. Because they're both infinite.
Well, you'll see that we did not have a rigorous development of infinity until much later. So one that you've come across, we know that there's more real numbers than there are integers, but there's the same amount of integers as there are naturals. So that is a very recent discovery in terms of the history of time. I mean, I think it's Cantor who did that proof, and he's roughly around the year 1900. I'm not sure his exact dates. So getting that confusion completely out of the system took a while. As far as infinitesimals, no, we've been talking about that. I mean, that's what Zeno created all his paradox with, essentially, is infinitesimals. So we had that. You even have, I guess he's a bit later, Archimedes taking some basic integrals. Now he's going to be a few hundred years after these guys, but still well before calculus comes from Newton and Leibniz. Anyways, okay, so the idea that things are infinitely divisible is crucial for his philosophy. Since a thing is infinitely divisible, no matter how small, it can have infinite parts. Since it has infinite parts, it can conceivably be composed of infinitely many things. Right? So I can have everything in the universe, sum of everything, inside this one marker. Since I can make all those things infinitely small, and each little piece of this is infinitely divisible. Note that infinite divisibility leaves him susceptible to Zeno's paradoxes. I couldn't find how he dealt with Zeno's paradoxes. Since we have such limited amounts of him, he might have had arguments to deal with it, but we don't know. Or at least I couldn't find anything. Okay, so seeds of all things. So he called this infinite stuffs, he called it seeds. So using Anaxagoras' language, he'd say that there's banana seeds, there's air seeds, there's fire seeds, there's closed seeds, there's seeds of everything. So seeds is the words that he used when talking about these little elements. So when all things were together, not even was any color distinguishable, for the mixture of all things prevented it. Of the moist and the dry, of the warm and the cold, and the light and the dark, and of much earth that was in it, and of a multitude of innumerable seeds, in no way like each other. for none of the other things either is like any other, and these things being so, we must hold that all things are in the whole. Okay, so back in the very beginning, all things were mixed together in this one undifferentiated ball of stuff, and air and ether were what predominated, so it seems like it was air, but you had all the seeds in the beginning, and you couldn't really talk about the qualities of any of these things because all the qualities were mixed up all together. So you couldn't talk about its color, you couldn't talk about the light coming off of it, you couldn't talk about if it was warm or cold, none of that. And remember, for them, air is the best notion they have of something that doesn't really have any properties, which is why he's feeding so much off of Anaxagoras and saying that if you were to take it all, this undifferentiated stuff, you'd have air. So since there, and notice he says that there's an infinite number of the different types of seeds. So we don't have a finite number, infinite number, which probably takes care of any future possible inventions, past inventions, all that just exists. So since there are an infinite number of different types of things, we are going to need an infinite number of elements, or seeds, to use his language, to compose all these different things. We need banana seeds for bananas that have all the qualities of bananas, and once these seeds predominate in a thing, that thing seems like a banana, has all the qualities of a banana, and so we call it a banana. Does that make sense? This theory is starting to come together a little bit. And then, we already talked about this one, but go through it again. Everything is in all things. Everything is in all things. The seeds of everything are in everything. And since the portions of the great and of the small are equal in amount, they're both infinite, for this reason, too, all things will be in everything. Nor is it possible for them to be apart, but all things have portion of everything. And we can see that he's mixing up his idea of infinite and boundless here again, common thing that Greeks do. He's saying since there's an infinite amount of banana stuff, that banana stuff has to also be everywhere, since it's infinite, so it has to be in all things. Everything contains seeds of all things. A banana still contains infinitely many nose seeds, rock seeds, and fish seeds. A banana contains infinitely many seeds of everything. Why does it look like a banana? Because there is a greater portion of banana seeds compared to all the other seeds. For every one rock seed, there are 100 banana seeds, or whatever it is. So the banana seeds predominate in it, and so it gives off the qualities that those banana seeds have. And so that's where the banana taste comes from. So banana taste is inherent to a banana seed. You get enough banana seeds together so that they predominate in some object, then it's going to taste like a banana. It's going to have all the qualities that those banana seeds have. Everything obtains its unique characteristics from the predominance of those unique seeds. Infinitely many seeds with their own unique qualities, get enough of them together, and it shows those qualities. So now we can explain every quality in existence out there with these little seeds by having infinitely numbered seeds. Now, he actually had an argument particularly against there being 4 elements. So not only does he have his own theory, but he's explained why Empedocles is for sure wrong. We already talked about one of his arguments, that being that Empedocles still has new qualities coming into existence. But we'll look at why he says there can't be just 4 elements. So he completely disagrees with Empedocles' 4 elements, claims that Empedocles still has being coming from not being. How can hair come from what is not hair, or flesh from what is not flesh? How can I take the right combination of fire, water, earth, and air, things that definitely aren't hair, and then when it's all said and done, now I have hair, and not fire, water, earth, and air? Empedocles says flesh is a certain combination of the 4 elements, and Anaxagoras says if I have a piece of flesh and rip it in 2, I still have 2 pieces of flesh. And if I take one of those halves and rip it in 2, I still have 2 pieces of flesh. So it's absurd to have this notion that I can eventually break down flesh to fire, water, earth, and air. Every time I split it, I still just have flesh. So flesh must somehow be a fundamental component of the universe. There must be flesh seeds. We'd be very surprised to rip flesh in half and watch fire and water come out this end and earth and air come out the other end. So flesh is infinitely divisible. Tearing it in half always produces 2 smaller pieces of flesh with all the qualities of flesh. Change. So now how does he explain change? Since seeds of everything are in all things, we can now describe change without new things coming into being. Change is now just a separation off of some seeds, thereby changing the proportion of the seeds in the object. Now I said separation, but it can be separation and absorption. I have this space right here. If I can separate out a bunch of air and I can get it to somehow absorb a bunch of banana, I'll eventually have a banana right here. And that's how all change is described. When a banana grows, it's slowly banana seeds accumulating and other things being exterminated out, leaving somehow, making their way out. So that's how he's going to explain all change. It is important to note that after the change, there's still an infinite number of each kind of seed in that object, so that all that has really changed is the proportion of one seed to another. So if I take air and somehow turn it into a banana, I still have an infinite amount of air in my banana when I'm done. I didn't remove all the air, that's impossible. I just removed enough to change the proportion of air to other stuff. So a log burning might be viewed as wood seeds separating off from a log until there is no longer a predominance of wood, but rather a predominance of ash. So as the wood goes out, and maybe ash was the next most predominant thing inside of wood, inside of the log, and so once enough wood leaves, then the ash now predominates, and so now we have ash. There's still an infinite amount of wood seeds in the resulting ash. A quote we have from Aristotle, Anaxagoras says that the flesh from the food is added to our flesh. So that's eating. What happens off, you separate off the flesh atoms from inside the food and it adds to your flesh, and the rest goes through you. And that's how you get your nutrients from your food, and that's how you grow in size.
I'm confused why this dude is saying you can get flesh from, say, an apple, but you can't get fire from hair.
But you can't get fire.
That was his contradiction to the four elements thing. You can't get fire from hair, but you can get flesh from apples.
Because apples still contain flesh inside of them. And there's just a predominance of the apple stuff, which is why it seems like an apple. So he's saying that the reason it seems like an apple is because there's a bunch of apple stuff in there. There happens to also be flesh, but there's mostly apple stuff in there. And so hair, the reason it seems like hair is because there's mostly hair stuff in there. To say that's just fire, water, earth, and air, then where do all the qualities of hair come from?
Alright,
You see the difference?
kind of. Yeah.
And they have this notion of the fundamental components, so they think if you divide enough, you should be able to get back to your fundamental components. So he's saying hair has to be a fundamental component because no matter how much you divide hair, you still always have hair. You're never going to get down to fire, water, earth, and air.
Okay.
Any other questions about how change is now possible with these seeds?
Right. I don't understand why the four elements of the universe doesn't fit into the change rule, because their explanation for change is it didn't change. What was is now not what it was. It's just organized in a different way. That's all he's saying.
Well, so
Fire,
that
earth,
might.
water, air is just organized in a different way. All he's saying is, okay, we have infinite things. Now they're just organized in a different way. It's like the same definition for change.
Not quite, because he's not just using fire, water, earth, and air. So remember, with fire, water, earth, and air, so he's saying a banana is ultimately composed of fire, water, earth, and air. So he says, okay, Empedocles, explain to me where banana taste comes from.
Some combination?
See, in Anaxagoras' theory, there was already banana seeds which have all the qualities of bananas.
Yeah.
And so it's just predominant. So that's where he explains the banana taste coming from. How does Empedocles explain the banana taste coming into being? You say it's a certain combination of fire, water, earth, and air, but fire doesn't have that taste, earth doesn't, water doesn't, air doesn't. Go mix those together and somehow produce banana taste for me.
That's changed here. Yeah, that's, makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Any other? Okay. So now we'll jump into his cosmology. His cosmology is very similar to Anaximenes' cosmology. In the beginning, everything was combined into one with air and ether predominating. Remember, Anaximenes just says in the beginning there was air. He gave a whirling motion, and then things rarefied and condensed, producing all the different elements. We're going to have a similar thing happen here. So in the beginning, everything was all perfectly mixed together, since there's more air and ether in the entire universe than anything else. Remember, he still thinks about all of outer space being full of air. So that's why he thinks that air and ether, that's what composes all of outer space. That's why he thinks those predominate in our universe. Because when we look around, that's what most stuff is.
When does the concept of an atmosphere come into play?
I have no idea, but I would guess that
Socrates and
is.
those guys, I'm sure, assumed everything was air all the way up too.
Yeah, I would guess so. I don't think that you're going to have that until the scientific revolution.
What about the guy that talked about combustion or condensation and all that? Isn't that atmospheric?
Anaxagoras? Oh, so what he's saying, so Anaxagoras thought that the whole universe was full of air, but it condensed or rarefied. He's saying, where do we get the notion that, no, actually there's just this atmosphere around Earth, and outside that there's actually a vacuum. It's not air, you can't go out there and still breathe, it's a vacuum.
That's a vacuum.
Space?
Yeah.
What would you call it? It's a vacuum compared to anything you've experienced. It's not a perfect vacuum, but
Okay, whatever.
really close. Empty space is a vacuum. How else would you define a vacuum?
No, that's right.
Yeah. Anyways, so yeah, I'm not sure when the notion of, no, there must just be an atmosphere around the Earth, but I would guess it's within 100 years of Newton. So I would guess at least 1,000 years after these guys, if not closer to 2. Okay, the cosmology. Okay, so in the beginning there's this Parmenidean ball of stuff, undifferentiated. You can't tell the difference between over here and over here, with air and ether predominating. And it was, so in the beginning it was there, and it was given a whirling motion, and we'll explain how it got in motion here a little bit later. But, so it's given a whirling motion, and then that's going to start things separating off, seeds separating off. So due to a whirling motion, seeds begin separating off, and so different types of objects start coming into being, and ultimately the Earth is created. So I give a whirling motion, and somehow a bunch of the air seeds start separating off and going outside and leaving a predominance of other things on the inside. So he's going to have, well, we'll just read it. This is where he's explaining it. The dense and the moist and the cold and the dark came together where the earth is now, while the rare and the warm and the dry and the bright went out towards further parts of the ether. So you give it a spin, the heavier seeds stay here while the lighter ones separate off, which is why out there we have the fire, the stars, the sun, and we have a bunch of air out there, all of outer space being considered full of air and ether. From these, as they are separated off, earth is solidified. For from mist, water is separated off. From water, earth. From the earth, stones are solidified by the cold. And these rush outwards more than water. So you'll notice very similar to Anaxagoras here with the idea of you condense the air and you get mist. You condense the mist, you get water. You condense the water, you get earth. You condense the earth, you get stone. Similar thinking that he's using here. So basically stealing Anaxagoras' cosmology with tweaking it for his own little theory here.
Anaxagoras was the one who did the ether or the
Air,
air.
not a Piron. That was an Anaximander. Okay. So before we jump into his mind portion of it, we'll capture some more natural phenomena that he talked about. He gave a correct explanation for what eclipses are and how they occurred, so he wasn't, he was a very bright guy. He described the sun as a fiery mass much larger than the Peloponnesus. Remember, the Peloponnesus is the second part of the Greek peninsula, but the Greeks have no clue how small their little peninsula is compared to the rest of the world. He claimed that the moon was made out of the same stuff as the earth, so notice his notion that the sun being a physical thing and the moon being a physical thing are ultimately what gets him accused of impiety. Claimed that the moon was made out of the same stuff as the earth. Apparently, he must have had really good eyesight because he claimed that he could see mountains and valleys somewhat on the moon. So he didn't view it as a completely smooth surface. It is the sun that puts brightness into the moon, so he knew that the moon was just reflecting the sun's light. We call rainbow the reflection of the sun in the clouds. Not a terrible explanation for what a rainbow is. Little droplets of water basically what clouds are. Okay, so that covers his natural philosophy. Now we'll be jumping into how he introduces mind, unless you have any more questions about his natural philosophy. All right, then let's jump into mind. Now, mind prior to Anaximander, that's what we'll do first. Previous philosophers were Hylozois, probably right. They thought that matter was in some sense alive, intelligent, and capable of initiating its own movement, its own motion.
He was the guy who said mind's different from matter.
Yeah, he's the first one that's going to say, stop, we need to make a separation between these two things. And we're so used to thinking about mind and matter as separate things that it's hard for us to at first comprehend the way that early Greeks thought about the universe. So remember, going all the way back to Thales, the first one we talked about, he thought that all things have souls in them, so moving principle, and that the all is divine, and he also had that line about gods are in everything, or all things are full of gods, something like that. They very much had this notion of a moving principle being somehow endowed inside of individual objects, and they can move themselves if they so choose. And Anaximander is going to be the one that introduces this notion of, no, it's minds that make decisions and decide that things are going to happen, and that's not the same thing as matter. Those are two separate things. So Anaximander introduces, he calls it nous, but we typically just call it mind. That's the rough translation we use. So nous and mind are the same thing. Anaximander introduces nous, or mind, as the ordering force which is ultimately responsible for all movement. The closest thing that we've come across so far in this class to the way that Anaximander is going to use this word nous is the way that Heraclitus used the logos. Remember, Heraclitus had phrases like, the all happens according to the logos, or phrases to that effect. Logos somehow was seen as governing everything that happens in the universe, but was very unclear what exactly he was talking about. Anaximander is going to say that same thing in a very explicit way. He's going to say, nous is what sets the universe in order. Some great mind sets the universe in order, and it's mind that's responsible for making all choice in the universe. All purpose comes from this mind, ultimately. So in everything, there is a portion of everything except nous, and there are some things in which there is nous also. So not everything in the universe has mind. You have mind, I have mind, the table does not have mind. So we have, when it comes to this natural philosophy, when it comes to the physical substances, everything's in everything, and it's all mixed up together. Nous is the one thing that's special. Nous is separated off from all this stuff. It's not necessarily in everything. But nous can also be in there as well with the inanimate material. And so anything that has nous, anything that has mind, is capable of independent action. While anything that has life, and then to the extent that you have nous, it improves your ability to think. So you have more nous than just a plant, because a plant's just alive. You're alive, and you can move, and you can also think the way humans can think. So you also have more than an animal, because you're able to think more than an animal can. So that's how he's going to explain different levels of consciousness. Maybe it's the best way to say it. Is how much nous is in there. So nous is mixed in, we already said that. And when nous began to move things, separating off took place from all that was moved. And so much as nous set in motion was separated. And as things were set in motion and separated, the revolution caused them to be separated much more. So his view of the universe, remember that they don't have the same Jewish view of the universe where God creates the universe out of nothing. God comes along and actually creates the universe. He is not saying that here. The universe for him is still eternal. What happened is, sometime way into the past, the universe was this indifferentiated ball of stuff, and there was mind. And mind set the mass in motion. So this mind is not creating the universe, it's organizing the universe out of all the stuff that's there. So the mind puts all the mass into motion, spinning it, whirling it somehow, and then that starts the whole process. So some great mind came along and organized the universe that we now live in. So nous is ultimately what kicks off the creation of the universe. Go ahead.
He believes in the gods, right?
He believes in the gods.
So he would think that they're also made up of infinite things.
I don't have any fragments from him that say explicitly what the gods are. I mean, he's following from Anaxagoras, and Anaxagoras still had the gods, but the gods composed of physical air. So I would guess that Anaximander still has the gods composed of physical air, and he just views them kind of like super immortal humans. Not necessarily as a god the way that a Christian would think about the gods. They're still very limited beings. And so this nous is going to be something more like necessity in Greek mythology. This nous is governing over all things, including the gods, and the gods come under this nous. So we might be tempted to say, so the nous is like God in his universe. Well, that would kind of work if you didn't already have God somewhere in there, the way that the Greeks use gods. So that's why I can't answer it that way. But you feel like you got a good feel for it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Next quote, I guess. All other things partake in a portion of everything, while nous is infinite and self-ruled, and is mixed with nothing. Meaning, it's not required. It's every little bit of matter doesn't have endowed nous. I'm not sure how the nous goes into your body, but it's not physically attached with the other physical stuff that makes up your body. So it's not hooked in that sense, but you can still have nous inside of you. So don't get confused by the way he words that. So while nous is infinite and self-ruled and is mixed with nothing, but is alone itself by itself, for it is the thinnest of all things and the purest, and it has all knowledge about everything and the greatest strength, and nous has power over all things, both greater and smaller, that have life. And nous had power over the whole revolution, so that it began to revolve in the beginning, and all things that are mingled together and separated off and distinguished are all known by nous. So this mind, nous, is the great power in the universe, knows all things. You see it's very close to the one God that, who was it? Xenophanes, and who came after Xenophanes? Was it Melissus? Xenophanes and Melissus, the same notion of a God that they have in their minds. This mind seems to be capable of all those things as well. But now, for once, it's not that physical entity like they had. Well, I guess Melissus said everything is non-physical. So he's the first one separating it. So you know there's physical and non-physical, and the mind's non-physical. Nous is an intelligent force that governs over all things, knows all things, and is responsible for all movement in the universe. Anything in the universe capable of thought or action must in some way partake of nous. Those that don't, can't. And those that can't, don't. Go ahead.
So one of the reasons that Thales thought that the all is divine is because with magnets, they can move the rocks, right?
Right.
He's saying that stones don't have nous. So how does he explain that action?
Yeah, I don't know how he would explain the magnets. He might say that magnets have a teeny bit of nous in them, and that maybe somehow even magnets are a little bit alive, but he'd probably still distinguish that from a piece of wood. So he might argue that a magnet is somehow more alive than a piece of wood, but that a tree is more alive than a magnet. I'm not sure what his hierarchy for life would be there. But that's a good question. Any other questions? Okay, so now with Anaximander is the first time that we have a teleological view about the universe. So, quick definition of teleological. It's anything relating to or involving the explanation of phenomena in terms of the purpose they serve rather than the cause by which they arise. Does that make sense? We don't explain something as a result of some previous action, but it's rather explained in terms of a purpose that it serves. So this mind, you couldn't go do calculations that the consequence of that calculation means the mind is now going to set the matter in motion. The mind set the matter in motion for whatever purpose the mind had, for what would ultimately be accomplished by that matter in motion. A simpler way to think about it would be in terms of you when you make a choice. So there's two ways to explain you reaching out to a cup and drinking the water. One way to explain it would be over time, moisture's been leaving your body, all these chemicals bouncing around, somehow the moisture in your body's leaving, causes certain chemical reactions that ultimately leave and you physically just going out and grabbing it. And you were destined from the beginning of time to go and perform that action. Another way of viewing it is, no, you're endowed with a mind, and you had a purpose in mind to grab the drink and drink the water, and so that's the reason that you reached out and grabbed the cup and drank the water. It's explaining it in terms of the purpose you meant to fulfill. So there's going to be these two views on ways to explain things.
Which does he hold? The purpose one?
Well, he's the first one introducing this purpose one, a teleological view. The notion of explaining something in terms of a purpose it serves, rather than it must be that way because it was caused by these previous actions. So we'll see him as opposed to the Atomists, we're going to take the exact opposite view. Does that make sense? So notice that since mind is putting matter into motion for some rational purpose, then Anaxagoras is implying a teleological view on the creation of the world. So we had the mind, whatever it is, had a purpose when it set the world in motion and did it to fulfill some purpose. It's not that the mind was just these chemicals in motion that ultimately, deterministically, were eventually going to cause that motion and things just keep going on, chemicals in motion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Does he ever give the purpose, or does he just say there is one?
There is a purpose. I don't know what he would say the ultimate purpose of the universe is. However, as far as we can tell, this is the only time he invokes his nous when it comes to explaining his natural philosophy, putting things in motion. Later philosophers complain that he'll attribute the cause of something to anything but nous. So if he can get around using nous, he doesn't invoke it, only invokes it when he has to. Aristotle says he avoids using nous until he is completely at a loss to explain some phenomena, and then drags it in. So later philosophers complain that other than nous being what starts the universe going, any other time he brings nous into the picture, they feel like it's kind of a God of the gaps argument. Oh, I don't know the explanation, must be what nous wanted.
He probably got a lot of comments like you just said. Comments like that.
Well, actually, Aristotle praises him for this. So even though it sounds like Aristotle is being pretty negative of him there, he had a fairly positive view of his nous overall, because Aristotle is critical of the fact that all these philosophers up till now just think that everything that's happening is randomly happening, and it just so happens to do what it happens to do. Whereas for once, someone's talking about, no, there's actually a purpose in all this, and that because Aristotle's going to use later the purpose in your actions for why you do something. So when we get to his 4 causes, one of them we'll see as a very teleological cause, borrowing this idea from Anaximander. So sounds negative, the stuff I use, but overall I'd say that Aristotle has a very positive view of him relative to other past philosophers. Okay, so before we leave him, I just want to note, talking now about his natural philosophy, where we're at compared to where we started, and the mess that we're in trying to resolve Parmenides and Heraclitus. So, clear back at the start, when you first had Thales, what was Thales trying to do? He was trying to explain the one in the many, the unity amongst the diversity. He's trying to say we have all these different things, and there must be some relating stuff to all of them that we can talk about, that we can use to explain all the different things. And Anaxagoras, when we finally get to Anaxagoras, he comes out and says, nope, all we can say about all these different things is that they are their particular type of thing. All we can say about bananas is that they're banana stuff. All we can say about chairs is that they're chair stuff, and we can't find any uniting principle underlying everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Which kind of breaks down science right at the beginning. It's pretty useless if all I can say about tables is they're composed of table stuff. That's all I can say about tables. I can't talk about them in terms of any more fundamental units and work my way up to table stuff. He says, no, anytime we do that, we have what is becoming what is not, and what is not becoming what is. You had the properties of tables coming from things that obviously aren't tables. The qualities of tables coming from things that obviously aren't tables. That doesn't work. Qualities of bananas coming from things that aren't bananas. So it seems like if we're going to reconcile Parmenides and Heraclitus, so far it looks like the only way we can do that is to say everything existed always, and science kind of breaks down there. So you see the trouble we're in, and what the next atomists are going to, or what the next philosophers are going to be focusing on, how to deal with him. Okay, So any questions about him before we jump into the Atomists? All right, then let's jump into the Atomists. We have Leucippus and we have Democritus. Those are their dates. Leucippus, we know almost nothing about him. Some people argue that he actually didn't exist and it was only Democritus who did all this. So that's why we only have, remember when I stick just the 1 year up there, all we know is that he was kicking in that year. So no clue when he was born, when he died. We just know if he existed, most people would say that he did, then this is a year that he was active. So we'll start with Leucippus and then we'll go to Democritus. Now he's from Abdera, which is right up here. So both of them are going to be from Abdera. That's where the Atomists come from. No, we haven't done Protagoras yet. He's also from there, but he's later. So yeah, wouldn't have known anyone else from there. Now, a lot of argument about him, since there's argument about whether or not he even lived. One of the arguments is about where he was born. Some people say that he was born in Miletus. Other people say that he was born in Elea. Notice Miletus is where Thales and Anaximander and Anaxagoras are from. Elea is where Parmenides and Zeno are from. So, born in one of those two cities, or possibly born in Abdera, but for sure active in Abdera, and that's where he spent most of his time. So that's why he's referenced as being from Abdera, that city. He's going to steal some of Anaxagoras' notion of condensation and rarefication, which is why most people like to argue that he's ultimately from Miletus. Obviously, at this point, you wouldn't have to be from Miletus to know about Anaxagoras. His philosophy is pretty well spread by now. He's considered the teacher of Democritus, who we'll cover next, and he's considered the father of atomism. Now, atomism, we'll go into detail what this is, but this is going to be the way that we summarize it for the rest of the course when I go to remind you what it is. This is the expression I'm going to use. All that exists are atoms in the void. So this word atom, looking at its etymology, literally just means undivisible, undividable. So now we're going to get our first notion of atomic theory. An atom is going to be this undivisible ball, not necessarily a ball, it could be in any shape, but this undivisible piece of mass we're going to call an atom. So the simplest way to talk about their theory is there's a bunch of atoms, indivisible, fundamental components of reality, and then void for them to move around in. So there's just atom and void. Often given the analogy of just billiard balls flying around in empty space. Atoms in the void, that's all that exists. So that's the way that we'll summarize it. We'll go into the theory more. Now, he's going to be a mechanistic, first time we've seen that, materialist, pluralist. He's going to say the arche, the one stuff, the fundamental components of the universe, not one stuff because he's a pluralist, are going to be atoms. And there's going to be infinitely many different types of atoms. Materialist, we've already talked about materialist. Thales was a material monist. He thought everything was a material substance, namely water. He's also going to be a mechanistic materialist. So we'll go into each of those right here and get a better feel for what exactly this is and what it entails. So materialism. Matter is the fundamental reality. Anything non-material is simply a derivative to be explained entirely in physical terms. Thales thought everything could be explained just with water. Anaxagoras thought everything could be explained just with air. They were materialists. Now, he's going to be the first explicit mechanist. So what's mechanism? Everything happens according to the laws of mechanics. It is contrasted with teleology, the idea that purpose is operative somewhere in the universe. So we're going to be contrasting these two ideas, a teleological view versus a mechanistic view. Note that these two together, materialism and mechanism, together are typically seen as implying a strict determinism, and definitely did for Leucippus or Leucippus. I'm not sure how I've been saying that. Leucippus and Democritus. This reduces all human action to what we typically say as chemicals and motions. So there is no such thing as free will with their notion of atoms in the void in their atomic theory. So you have atoms jiggling around. They're jiggling around according to mechanical laws, and that's all that's going to happen forever. If I could perfectly capture the state of the universe now, I can tell you how it's going to be infinitely far into the future and infinitely far into the past. if I could somehow figure out exactly how all the atoms in here were jiggling it all around you, I could tell you everything that you're going to do into the future and everything you've done in the past.
So
It
mind
can all be
has nothing
determined.
to do with it?
Mind has nothing to do with it. Mind has no physical effect on the universe around us. You understand determinism, right? Determinism, everything can be determined. No such thing as free will, no such thing as a choice. You never really make a choice. Everything you're going to do has already been determined, and you're just going through the motions. Mechanistic materialists. So, our only fragment extant from Leucippus is nothing happens at random, all happens out of reason or by necessity. Now, we use that word random two different ways, so we need to understand it, right? One of the ways we often use the word random is purposeless. He was randomly walking around the room. He was purposelessly, he was walking around the room without any purpose in mind. Just randomly walking around the room. There's random in that sense. And then there's random in the sense that you can't determine what's going to happen. It's completely random. This is like the randomness of quantum mechanics. It's completely random. There's no way to determine. If I know that the electron's here and I send it through the dual slit experiment, which you might be familiar with, there's no way to know for sure exactly where it's going to come out on the screen. It's completely random. Does that make sense? E means random in that second sense. Everything is determined. There's no randomness in the universe. Everything happens according to reason or by necessity. Everything that happens was necessarily going to happen. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. No choice about it. And it's going to be useful to use randomness later in that without purpose type way. So don't get confused when I accidentally use randomness in the sense that we use it a lot. But you understand the two different types of random I'm saying, right? Okay. So since, should have mentioned, since so little is known about Leucippus, or Leucippus, I keep forgetting how I was saying it. Since so little is known about him, I'm not going to try to distinguish what he contributed versus what Democritus contributed. So I'm just briefly covering him and everything we know for sure about him. Then we're going to cover Democritus real quick, and then we're just going to talk about the atomic theory and not worry about assigning credit one way or another, because they both developed a consistent idea with the atomic theory. Make sense? Go ahead.
So all the philosophers beforehand thought anything is infinite because you can keep splitting it apart and splitting it apart. How does he argue that it ends up being one thing? Because if it's a piece of matter, why can't you split it apart again?
He's going to say that, why can't you? Because he's going to say fundamentally there's atoms that make up everything, and atoms are indivisible. So you can see how he's going to try and get himself away from a lot of Zeno's, for example, Zeno's paradoxes. He's going to say, no, Zeno, you're cheating. Matter isn't infinitely divisible. There's a fundamental, undivisible little piece of matter, and you cannot break it. It's like a Parmenidean one. So the same way Parmenides says, what does Parmenides have? He has the entire universe is this plenum of mass. Nothing's ever happening in it, undifferentiated, just a big ball of mass. The Atomist would say, Parmenides, you're kind of there. Imagine we take that ball, shrink it down really, really small, and now make infinitely many of them moving around in the void. That's the atomic theory.
Well, how does that explain that you can't split it apart again?
They're not using their theory to argue that you can't split it again. They're saying, we're going to start out with an atom, something indivisible that can't be
It's
split.
fundamental building.
Yeah, it's their fundamental for building up their worldview. Atoms. Look, here's one way you can view it. They say, look, if you allow infinitely divisibility, you get the contradiction of Zeno. Therefore, you can't have infinite divisibility. Zeno says, therefore, you can't have change. They says, nope, you're messing up. What you proved is you can't have infinite divisibility. That's where your problem is. It's not the change. And that's one way you can view it if you want. I don't know if I have a specific argument for how they rationalize that later in here. So maybe we'll come back to it. Not sure. Okay, so now Democritus. Now, everyone we've been talking about is thrown into the rough category of pre-Socratic, and we would still call Democritus a pre-Socratic, even though his life overlaps Socrates' life quite a bit, and in fact he outlived Socrates, I think. So why do we call him a pre-Socratic? The reason that he's still going to be thrown in with the pre-Socratics is that the topics that he's interested in and the philosophical questions he's addressing are still the same types of questions that philosophers prior to Socrates were talking about. We're going to see with Socrates, there's a sudden shift in the interest of philosophy, and everyone after Socrates followed Socrates. So Socrates fundamentally changes the way that philosophers go about their work. And so since there's that fundamental change with him, that's how we split it up with the pre-Socratics and then those after Socrates. So it's not necessarily chronological, it's just really close to. It's what they were interested in, and obviously the Atomists are still very much interested in dealing with Parmenides and Heraclitus. So that's why we still call him a pre-Socratic. He wrote a ton. We're not positive how much he's written. Supposedly written between 52 and 60 works, but some people argue that some of the works attributed to him actually came from his teacher, Leucippus, and some of the works were also later students just continuing his line of thought. But nonetheless, good reason to believe he just wrote a ton. And he wrote on several different subjects. He wrote works on ethics, physics, mathematics, music, cosmology, everything. So he was viewed as a polymath in his day, a man who knows everything and wrote on everything. Didn't limit himself to just one book.
How much of his works do we have now?
None. So that shows you how fickle history is. I mean, you had Anaxagoras before him who only had one work, and we happen to have 20 fragments from him. Democritus had 52 to 60 works, and we don't have a single bit of him extant, none of his works. What we get through history and what we don't, it's just somewhat random. So yeah, none of his works are extant. But fortunately, a lot of people that we do have works on were very interested in what he had to say, like Aristotle, for example. And in fact, Aristotle wrote an entire work just talking about the atomic theory. Unfortunately, that work is lost. So you get what you get. Anyways, so following his teacher Leucippus, so he's also a mechanistic materialist and a pluralist. Same thing, archaeous atoms. And then one thing interesting about him, he's known as the laughing philosopher. When we get to his ethics, he emphasizes being a cheerful person. So cheerfulness is what he emphasizes in his ethics. So considered a very light-hearted man. But before we get to his ethics, we'll get into his atomic theory and reintroduce the problem that the atomic theory is meant to deal with. So, quick recap. Empedocles says that he doesn't have being coming from non-being since everything is just different combinations of the four elements. And Anaxagoras says, no, you're still cheating. So he says that Empedocles still has being coming from non-being since he has bananas coming from non-bananas, the four elements. The only way to prevent being coming from non-being is to have everything always exist. So that's what they got to deal with here. And it's these qualities of bananas that are giving them such a problem. So the atomists say we've got to make a distinction here. Atomists say we have to distinguish between two types of properties that a particular object can have. It has its qualitative properties. Oh, no, that's right. I was just thinking the wrong word in my head. It has its qualitative properties, namely smell, taste, temperature, color, texture, etc. And then its quantitative properties, size, shape, motion, weight. So the atomists are going to be the first one to make this distinction and say, no, there's two types of properties. We're going to call some qualitative and some quantitative. And we're only going to call the quantitative ones as existing in reality and the qualitative ones as existing in the mind, so not in reality. And that's how they're going to deal with the problem of something like bananas coming from non-banana stuff. They're going to say that that banana taste doesn't really exist.
Just your brain.
There's no such thing as banana taste. That only exists in your mind. That doesn't exist in reality. And so when you have that banana taste, when you experience that banana taste, that had nothing to do with anything new actually coming into existence. So that's how they're going to come about attacking these two problems. So let's get to how they differentiate this a little bit more. So the quantitative properties, these are the real properties. The quantitative properties exist in nature. They are objective and exist independent of humans. If there were no humans, every object would still have the quantitative properties that it has. Qualitative properties, on the other hand, exist by convention. They are artificial human constructs dependent on humans for existence. The qualitative properties are just human experiences of the objects. They're not in the objects themselves, they're just something humans experience in their interactions with the objects. So they're not fundamentally a part of reality. Atoms only have quantitative properties. The qualitative properties are not real and only exist in the minds of the observers as a result of atoms in the world interacting with atoms in the body. So somehow physical atoms interact with atoms in your body, creating some motion that ultimately results in your mind having this experience of banana taste. But the banana taste only exists in your mind. That's not a physical thing, banana taste. Another example to show you a difference between, to show you why they would argue something like temperature is a qualitative property rather than a quantitative property. They say something like, look, imagine I've got 3 beakers here. They wouldn't say beakers, buckets. Imagine I've got 3 buckets here, and in one bucket I put boiling water in. In another bucket, I put room temperature water in. In another bucket, I put ice freezing water in. If you go stick your hand in the ice freezing water, then you stick it in the room temperature water, you'll say, oh, this water is so warm. If you go stick your hand in the boiling water, and then you go stick it in the room temperature water, you'll say, oh, how cold. Same exact water, 2 very different experiences. Is the water really warm? Is the water really cold? What is it really? You can't say what it really is because temperature isn't a real property of something. That's an experience that the humans have, and the temperature of that water only exists in your mind. It has nothing to do with actual reality.
What about the steam of the boiling water?
The steam is still a physical atoms coming up, so those are physical things. It's going to be the combination of Pythagoras and the Atomists that give us our foundation for science. So Galileo is one that combines these two. So they do the job of separating qualitative versus quantitative. That's the words we use now. They would say that exists by nature versus that exists by convention. We now have a notion in modern science of something that's quantitative is something that you can actually go measure. And so now we actually know how to measure temperature. So chances are if Democritus was alive today, then he'd talk about temperature as one of these quantitative properties rather than a qualitative property. Because we now know temperature is a measure of kinetic energy in a certain volume of air, whatever you're taking the temperature of. We can measure it.
I was wondering why motion was on that list of qualitative.
Did I put motion with qualitative?
On the previous slide.
Oh, it should have been with quantitative. That was a typo.
Oh, it was quantitative. You're right. You had it right.
Okay, yeah. So these are the...
So why motion on quantitative?
Why?
I mean, why is motion on that list?
So these are the same. They're saying if you look at the properties of atoms, atoms have 4 properties and only 4 properties. They have their size, their shape, their motion, their velocity, how they're moving, and their weight. And those are the only properties atoms actually have. Any other properties you experience are going to be qualitative properties that only exist in your mind. So they're going to say these 4 don't just exist in your mind. No one's going to disagree about size, no one's going to disagree about shape or motion or weight. Everyone will agree about these 4, but something like temperature, people might disagree about it, and how can you say what it really is? Is that water really warm or cold? 2 different people having 2 very different experiences with the same object. That's going to be their thinking. Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
So if you were to eat food, like normal food that helps nurture your body, versus eating food that would be poisonous, how would that work in the with atoms? because they're
Well, that's
all
a
the
good
same,
intuition.
like,
No. Not all atoms are the same. There are infinitely many different types of atoms with infinitely many different shapes. You cannot make a periodic table of these atoms, so don't get confused with how we use the word atom in modern science. The way we use the word atom in modern science is probably closer to Empedocles' view of the four elements than these guys' view of atom. It's a hybrid between the two.
So these atoms are like seeds?
No, because the seeds, you can't talk about the size of a seed. Because any size you talk about has infinitely many of any seeds inside of it. But they're kind of like the seeds in that we had to have an infinite variety of seeds. They're going to say that there's an infinite variety of atoms, and according to their theory, there could potentially be atoms the size of our planet floating around in space somewhere. There's no reason that they have to be minuscule necessarily. Just so happens that the ones around us are minuscule.
Yeah, that was one thing that was difficult for me with the whole Atomist, because I immediately went to the smallest particle in my thinking, the smallest stuff.
Right. So no way uniform. I think they would still have types of atoms. So I could have an infinite number of atoms of the same type. So there could be two identical atoms, but not all atoms are close to identical. There's still an infinite variety in atoms. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Not sure we covered all this. Talked about that example. His most famous quote, Democritus' most famous quote, referencing the difference between qualitative and quantitative. Now remember, when he's talking, we're going to use the word qualitative and quantitative because that's terminology used now. But anytime he's talking about quantitative, he's going to talk about that which exists by nature, and qualitative, that which exists by convention. So his famous quote is, by convention sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but in reality, atoms in the void. So all those experiences just exist by convention. They're just experiences in your mind. Those aren't physical things. All that really exists, atoms in the void. And atoms only have the four properties. Any questions?
It's kind of a cool theory.
Yeah, it's a great foundation. I mean, even I would bet if you thought back to, if you've taken a chemistry class, I bet you that they start by talking about Democritus. It is the foundation of the atomic theory, what they're putting forward here. It's just not close to what the moderns had. So you don't want to make it look worse than it is, but at the same time you want to recognize it was a good theory for what they had at the time. So great theory, but tons of problems. And good one for us to work on and make better. Let's see. All the appearance. Did I skip a slide? No. Okay, so now we're going to talk about. All the appearances of new qualities, namely color, taste, odor, coming into being and passing away, are purely due to different combinations and rearrangements of atoms with the varying qualitative differences. So all in addressing Anaxagoras, so Anaxagoras' example of the banana and the banana taste coming into being, they're going to say, no such thing as banana taste. Everything can still be explained in terms of the different atoms and their different size, shape, and motion. And those different atoms, when you consume them and put them in your mouth, they cause interactions, which cause interactions, which cause interactions. Big chain of interactions, which ultimately your mind interprets as a sensation or experience of the taste of banana stuff. So, taste of bananas, those qualities, color, taste, odors, those all just exist in your mind, but they are still a side effect of very physical interactions. So they're still explaining everything in terms of these physical interactions, but they're going to say that the qualitative experiences only exist in your mind. In other words, all qualitative differences can be explained purely quantitatively with nothing new actually coming into being or going away. They admit there are qualities coming to be and passing away, but since qualities only exist in the mind, they are not real. So we are not violating Parmenides. You're having different experiences in your mind. In reality, nothing actually changed. So Parmenides is not being violated. We never have what is becoming what is not. We never have what is not becoming what is. Make sense how they're addressing this? Okay. So, agreed that there being motion implied that there is not being. So now we've talked about the atoms, now we need to talk about the void part. Because maybe think back to Parmenides for a second. Parmenides, one of the ways that he talked about being has to be this one solid being. You can't have some being here and some being here. The way he talked about that is, like, if I have a piece of being here, and I have another piece of being here, if I have two separate pieces of being, what's in between them? Yeah, if it's not being, then it's not being. So you have not being between them, and you can't have not being being. You can't have not being exist. That's contradiction. The atomists are going to say, no, that's only a contradiction if you have being becoming not being.
Yeah.
So it's perfectly fine that you have being, and not being here, the void here. That's perfectly fine, as long as you don't have this becoming being and being becoming not being. So they're saying, Parmenides, you're not quite right. So they're going to allow for being, that's going to be all the atoms, and that's all the being that there ever is, and then not being, that's the void. And that's all the not being that there ever is. So they're never going to allow being to become not being and not being to become being. You never have more or less atoms, you never have more or less void. You have exactly as much as you have. Now remember, they need the void to allow for motion. Because one of the ways that Zeno keeps arguing against the possibility of motion is you need the empty space to move into, but how are you going to get empty space? Empty space for them is the same thing as not being. So they need to have some argument for the void so that they can have their atoms in the void. So they agreed that there being motion implies that there is not being the void. So since motion is an obvious fact, there must be void. Void must somehow exist. Also, since there's a variety of things, there must be more than one atom. Any two atoms must be distinct and separate from each other. Otherwise, they'd be one and the same atom. So why isn't there just one? So there's a variety of things in our universe. There's at least you and me. We're two separate things. So if there's at least two separate things, since there's a variety of things, there must be more than one atom. You're made of at least one atom. I'm made of at least one atom. So we're two distinct atoms. The reason I say you and I are separate things is because we're separate. We're separated off. We're not touching. And so we must be at least two atoms. So since there's a variety of things, there has to be a variety of atoms. And if they weren't separated off, then they'd really be connected, and we wouldn't have called them two atoms. We'd call them one atom. Therefore, there must exist empty space between the atoms, namely the void. So since there's a variety of things, that's another argument for there has to be the void. So you see the two arguments? Argument number one, there's motion, therefore there has to be the void. Argument number two, there's two separate things, and if you have two separate things, since they're separate, there has to be the void. That's their two arguments for the void. Therefore, both being, namely atoms, and not being, the void, exists, and are the fundamental constituents of the universe. Note that we never have the same thing both being and not being, so we do not have what is becoming what is not, or what is not becoming what is. So they thought they were still in the clear because being and not being are still separated off, but they both exist. So they can still justify change. Okay, Aristotle commenting on their atomic theory. Leucippus and his associate Democritus hold that the elements are the full and the void. They call them being and not being respectively. Being is full and solid, not being is void and rare. Since the void exists no less than body, it follows that not being exists no less than being. The two together are the material cause of existing things. We'll understand that better when we get to Aristotle. And just as those who make the underlying substance one generate other things by its modifications, and postulate rarefication and condensation as the origin of such modifications, namely Anaxagoras, in the same way, these men too say that the differences in atoms are the causes of other things. They hold that these differences are three: shape, arrangement, and position. Being, they say, differs only in rhythm, touching, turning, of which rhythm is shape, touching is arrangement, and turning is position. Now you'll notice with those, they left off weight as a fundamental property. That's one that we listed earlier. Whether atoms have weight or not is one that's argued back and forth. Most of the time I'm just going to pretend that they have weight. But let's look at these three on how they also change, because Aristotle also gave a little example on how each of those differ. We'll get to it in the third one, so let's continue here. All that exists are atoms in the void. Each atom is an eternal, minute, unchanging, indivisible plenum of being, a Parmenidean one. Note that atom means indivisible. We already talked about that. So I feel like you got a good notion for what one particular atom is like. We don't know its shape, but whatever it is going to be this eternal, never changing internally and exists forever, eternal, minute, really small, unchanging, indivisible plenum. Plenum means it's completely solid inside of itself. There's no empty space inside of there. Plenum of being. An atom. All atoms are composed of the exact same stuff, namely being. So atoms can vary in shape and size and arrangement. Let's see, is that the three they said? We'll go through. Here's the three ways that they vary. And then possibly weight is the one that should also be on there that Aristotle didn't mention. So there are infinitely many atoms differing from each other in shape. So the comparison Aristotle gives is essentially, look at A compared to B. Those have very different shapes. Orientation, look at N and Z. Now, the font makes those look slightly different, but you can see how N and Z, that's just one letter. If you turn it, you get the other. You just change the orientation to get from one to the other. And position, you can have AH or HA. The only way that those two differ are by position. So this is the only three ways that atoms differ from each other. Some say that weight was also a fundamental property of atoms. Other that individual atoms have no weight. I think most people are on the side of atoms having weight because that also gives their explanation for motion. Because they're going to view gravity as something that's everywhere in the universe. And so if everything has weight, then everything is endowed with motion now. And you can get motion started and going. Does that make sense? Let's see. Some say that weight, others that individual atoms have no weight. Okay, now what are these atoms doing? They are all randomly, meaning purpose, without purpose. Can't say that. They're all moving around without purpose, like a bunch of marbles in a vacuum. Like throw a bunch of marbles in outer space in some confined space and watch them bounce around with each other. They're all randomly moving around in the void, non-being, colliding together to produce the appearance of things coming to be and passing away. A bunch of atoms randomly come together and look at for a second we've got some physical thing, and the atoms slowly jiggle off and go away from each other, and that physical thing ceases to be. So that's coming to being and passing away. That's how they're going to describe change. Just this random motion of atoms.
It's a random motion of atoms and how it is sustained.
Purpose.
Sustained in form.
Sustained in form. Velcro. Have you ever used Velcro before? You know what Velcro is, right? Have you ever looked closely at a piece of Velcro? On one side of Velcro, you got something that looks like this. That's the hard plastic part, and there's a bunch of little hooks like that. And on the other side of Velcro, you have a bunch of stringy loops. Right? And if you take those, shove them together, now a bunch of them are caught, and it's hard to pull it off. And so it sticks together. Now you can pull it off, and it takes a force to pull them off, but otherwise they stick together. In the same way, atoms have all these hooks coming off of them, and their shape is going to be this weird, funky looking thing. And so the atoms can have these hooks coming off that can grab onto each other and hold them together, but eventually they could get knocked hard enough that they come off.
So basically saying when they hit, then they kind of latch on and they create a form.
Create a form, but a loose form. They're not actually hooked together. It's just one hook touching another hook. The same way that, watch me hook these two markers together. Now they're still two very separate markers, but due to their physical shape, I can make them hook together, and now it seems like they're one, even though they're not. And if something came along hard enough, it could knock off the marker. So this marker randomly moving around could pop right in there, okay, and I could get a bunch of them. Now a long marker string came into being, but then some object comes along and whacks it, and now that marker goes away. So you got the fruit growing, the atoms are coming together as the fruit gets bigger, and then they start going away and the fruit decomposes, and eventually it's nothing. Something like that. Make sense? We'll get into more detail with that in a second. But
So what happens when, like, how do they explain like eating? Does it actually like go into the person?
Eating?
Yeah, eating.
Eating, yes. Eating, it actually goes into you. But all your flesh is hooked together in this same way. You're not one solid thing of being. You're just a bunch of little atoms that happen to be hooked together like Velcro's hooked together. All your skin atoms, all your everything is hooked together with all these random hooks all touching together, holding them together. But it's possible for me to whack you hard enough for some of those atoms to go off. Right? There's no part of you that couldn't theoretically be knocked off. Divided off from you. It's only the atoms that are undivisible.
When
So
you eat something, it becomes literally part of you.
No. The atoms are still separate atoms. I eat the apple, some of the atoms are taken off and they hook the same way that these hook together with parts of my body. But that atom can also be taken off just as easily.
Okay, so it becomes a part of you.
Okay, becomes a part of you, sure.
I mean, like
It hooks the same way that these are hooking. But they're still two very separate markers. That's how all the atoms are. It's like building you out of Lego. As you eat, more Lego pieces can be added. And at the same time, Lego pieces are constantly coming off of you just through life. Everything's always deteriorating as well. So you got to keep eating the Lego to keep rebuilding yourself because pieces keep being knocked off all the time. And if you stop, you die, and eventually all the pieces go away. There's no longer a Leah. Does that make sense now? All right. Okay, since all atoms are the exact same stuff, the observed differences in materials must result from the shape, size, and arrangement of atoms, possibly their weight as well. So, the atoms that stick together, the atoms stick together via their varying shapes. Use Velcro as an example. One atom might have a bunch of stringy things coming off it like this. One atom might have a bunch of hooks coming off it like this. Those two atoms are going to stick together very well. And then you look at something like water atoms. Water atoms must be mostly smooth, right? You watch water, it doesn't stick to itself very well. Now it does a little bit. They probably knew that if you stare at a cup of water and you keep trying to fill it, you can actually fill up the water a little bit above the edge of the container. So water must not be perfectly spherical. It must have some hooks and stuff coming off of it so it can hook to other waters. But it's got to be pretty close to a pretty smooth thing since it's not very good at hooking. Whereas whatever rock atoms are made of, it's really hard to take a rock and get that thing to separate. So those things must have a lot of hooks. It also must be hard to get them to hook, but once you get them to hook, it must be hard to separate them as well, whatever they are. So whatever the different experiences we have with macro objects is going to result from the micro differences in those individual atoms. Water atoms must be small, very smooth, since water doesn't stick together very well, whereas iron atoms are large and extremely rough with lots of hooks because iron, when you get it hooked together, very hard to separate. A small stone and a cotton ball of the same size have different weights due to the amount of void in each of the macroscopic objects. So if we take the view that atoms also have weight, and that weight is somehow a measure of how much being is in them, then the way that we explain why, if I have a rock this big and a cotton ball this big, why does the rock weigh more, is because its being is all more closely packed together. And however the atoms of my cotton ball are hooking together, there's a lot of empty space in there, so there's a lot more void, less being, and so it's lighter. Pretty intuitive to how we currently think about weight. Any questions with any of those? Okay. Okay, so how they talk about change. Note that all change can be described as coming to be and passing away. That's how we always describe change. So, quote, since I don't have a name here, I'm guessing it comes from Aristotle. As they, the atoms, move, they collide and become entangled in such a way as to cling in close contact to one another, but not so as to form one substance of them in reality of any kind whatever. So the two hooks come together the same way that those markers did, but these aren't fusing together to create one solid thing of being. There's still some void between them. For it is very simple-minded to suppose that two or more could ever become one. The reason he gives for atoms staying together for a while is in the intertwining and mutual hold of the primary bodies. For some of them are angular, some hooked, some concave, some convex, and indeed with countless other differences. So he thinks they cling to each other and stay together until such time as some stronger necessity comes from the surrounding and shakes and scatters them apart. So that's the actual explanation that we have for how that works. Pretty close to what we were saying here, right? Any questions with that quote? Good? Okay, so atomists, we know that they're these mechanistic materialists. What about soul? How do they go about explaining the souls that we have inside of us and the souls that seem to be conscious of what's going on in the world around us? So the atomists still claim that there is a soul, but the soul is still composed of atoms, just like everything else. There's such things as soul atoms. Now, soul atoms for them are the most perfect atoms. They're completely spherical. They are the finest atoms, perfectly spherical, and responsible for giving rise to all life and consciousness. So consciousness is a consequence of a strong concentration of soul atoms together. Well, life is a concentration of soul atoms together, and even more concentration doesn't only produce life, but it also produces consciousness. And you'll notice that for living things, the more alive they are, the more that they need to breathe, is one of the things that he argues. That's to keep on bringing the soul atoms into you. Remember, these soul atoms are perfectly spherical, and they're the finest atoms, which means they're the easiest ones to escape from you. So it's very hard to keep soul atoms together, and so we have to actively work to keep those soul atoms in us. And no matter how hard we try, as the day winds down, it just so happens that enough of them escape through us, through our motion, I guess, that we couldn't quite keep them in, and we eventually lose our consciousness and fall asleep. And we sleep and we're not moving, so it's easier for us to accumulate them, and once we get enough of them, we're able to wake up. Now, these soul atoms are really fickle things, and so through some random chance, just throughout the day, you might randomly have a good amount escape you, and you might faint. But then some come back into you, and you come back to consciousness. So life is having a certain concentration of these soul atoms, and consciousness is having an even higher concentration of these soul atoms inside of you. And no matter how hard you try, eventually these soul atoms are all going to escape, and you're eventually going to lose your consciousness and then slowly die. They view dying as a slow process, not you're alive, then you're dead. They viewed it as you slowly die, so it's a dragged out process, but eventually you die once you lose all your soul atoms. There's no afterlife, there's no notion of your soul staying together. Those soul atoms do, but those soul atoms float off and someone else breathes them in, and so now your soul's a part of their soul, and you as an identity cease to be after you died. You were just whatever random collection of soul atoms happened to be inside of you. I think I covered everything there. Any questions about how they viewed the soul with soul atoms?
So, how they viewed dying, what if you did die suddenly?
Well,
You were
just
killed in
have
battle
the
or
capacity to.
Yeah, so like someone decapitates you, those soul atoms just, they go flooding out of you. And that's
So it's
just
not a
really
slow
quick.
Process, it's not like that.
No, I should have said that death is always a slow process. Death is typically a slow process. So they don't think, okay, this person lost consciousness, now they're dead. They think they lost consciousness and they're on their way to death. I don't know if there was some notion with like common medicine recorded where people did lose consciousness and seemed like they were dying and somehow came back. Then they had some recordings of that. I'm not sure. But it was stressed that they viewed dying as a process, not a sudden thing. The soul atoms don't suddenly escape, and I don't know what the concentration is before you're considered dead, but some concentration. Any other questions on the soul? All right. Afterlife. I guess I already went into this one. Once your soul atoms leave you, you are gone. There is no afterlife. The same way that your body eventually decomposes into the surrounding world, so too does your soul decompose into everything else when you die. It's just atoms, just like everything else. Even the gods, so they did believe in gods, but they believe that gods themselves are still just composed of atoms, and the gods too will eventually perish. Nothing's permanent. There's no such thing as immortality. So they believed in Zeus, but Zeus his, through random chance, eventually he's going to lose that concentration of soul atoms that are keeping him alive and conscious. And so he's destined to die too.
Not really a God.
Well, it's hard to capture exactly what the Greeks mean by this word God because they use it for such a varying amount of things. You have like the demigods, which I'm not sure if some of them were meant to be immortal, maybe some were. Then you have the gods. You even have a hierarchy of gods, and then you have necessity in their mythology, which seems like a god but is overall the gods. And then you have people like Xenophanes and Melissus talking about the god over everything. And so when they're talking about the gods here, they mean like Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, etc. Any other questions before we get into perception? They have an interesting notion of perception, very similar to Empedocles. Do you remember Empedocles' notion of perception? This was a funny one. So Empedocles thought that the elements are always coming off of you, right? And that I have a bunch of pores in my skin and pores in my eyes and pores all over my body. So the fire, water, earth, and air is coming off of you, and some of it goes into me, and it connects with my fire, water, earth, and air, and somehow that communicates information about where those elements ultimately came from, which makes me see you, know you, understand you. And I have to concentrate to keep those elements inside of me. If I stop concentrating, they're able to escape, and I'll forget, and I no longer have that knowledge inside of me. That was Empedocles' notion of perception and knowledge. So you're going to see how they kind of steal from that with perception. So now the atomist notion of perception. The random motion of any object's atoms cause its outer shell to be in a state of constant decay. As I'm standing here, atoms are constantly decaying off my outer shell. My inner atoms might be okay, they're not going anywhere, but my outer shell is constantly shedding off all the time. The decaying atoms are carried through the air and travel to our eyes, carrying the outer shell image. So a bunch of atoms are coming off my front right now, going forward into your eyes. You're getting some, you're getting some, you're getting some, right? They're constantly decaying, coming off, and some of those atoms are going into your eye, which is causing you to see me. Because a version of my exterior, all my outer atoms, just went into your eye, at least the ones facing you. So you can't see my back because all those atoms went that way, but you can see my front because that's those atoms going this way. And since it's physical atoms going into your eyes like you're seeing me, the further away I am from you, the harder it is for you to see me. And the more air that it has to travel through, the more the atoms carrying my image might get distorted, and so I might look a little distorted to you the further away I go. So that's their notion of perception. Now, the impact of the atoms on our sense organs is what enables us to perceive the decaying object. So physical atoms come off of you, and then they hit something like my eyes. This collision creates a string of internal collisions. So those atoms hit atoms, which causes other atoms to get hit, other atoms get hit, just a string of atoms going off in collision. This collision creates a string of internal collisions and motions, ultimately moving our soul atoms so as to be conscious of the image of the atoms we are seeing. So all my thought, all my perception is due to motion of soul atoms, and somehow ultimately you shedding off your outer atoms and those going through my eyes is creating that certain motion which causes the experience of my soul of seeing you, which makes me conscious of your image. So all very physical. The atoms coming off objects further away from us have to travel through more air to reach us. We already talked about that. Further away, harder it is to see them. Any questions about perception? Okay. Some of their cosmogony. They give a cosmology not too different from Anaxagoras, who gave one not too different from Anaximenes, so we won't go into that one. We've covered that one like 6 times. We'll just cover the major differences. The major difference is that while Anaxagoras used nous to give the initial motion that starts off creation or starts off the organization of the world, while the atomists just have it randomly happen. Is everything jiggling randomly, and eventually motion just kicks off that creates our whole universe. Humans and other living things seem to come somewhat suddenly from slime in their explanation.
Slime.
From slime. So everything's randomly jiggle. eventually we got the jiggling of atoms, which produced what we experience as slime, and then they have a suddenly come into being. You might remember it was still Empedocles. He had the elements randomly coming together, and eventually you got something like an eyeball, and an arm, and a finger, and a horn, and a cow ear, and those randomly jiggle around and jiggle together until they produce the animals that we know and love, along with all sorts of other weird creations. Like 6 arms might have come together to produce some weird creature thing, I don't know what you want to call it. But only those things which were able to adapt to their surrounding and survive were able to reproduce and continue on, which is why now we just have the animals today. All the other creatures that randomly came into existence pretty quickly died off. So in that sense, Empedocles gave a much better explanation than the Atomists. The Atomists have, well, you got slime and pretty soon humans just come into existence. So, nothing too great there. Yeah, they're epistemology. So, since in reality there is only atoms and the void, and since it is impossible to have any direct sense experiences of either of these, truth is difficult to know. So, do we remember what epistemology is? The study of knowledge. So they're going to be talking about how we come to know things, and they're essentially going to be arguing it's really hard for you to ever come to know anything. So reality is just atoms in the void. That's all that really exists. So if we want to know about reality around us, we need to know about these atoms and the void. And since it's impossible to have any direct experience of either of these, truth is difficult for us to know. You can't experience any atom directly, and you can't experience the void directly. Right? Same way we have the same notion today. You can't go and experience just a particular H2O atom and look at water, a particular water molecule. So, one of his famous quotes in reference to truth, of a truth we know nothing. I think that's just supposed to be, of truth we know nothing, for truth is in a well. It's very hard, it's core down there, it's deep, it's in a well, hard for us to reach. So the truth has to do with atoms in the void, that's microscopic, we're macroscopic, hard for us to have knowledge on what's really going on. Since the majority of our experiences are the qualitative properties of an object, and since these exist in the mind alone and not in reality, he views almost all knowledge as insufficient and subjective. This might be the first time we use that word, subjective. Is that the first time we've used subjective? Is there anyone confused by the difference between subjective and objective? We feel like we all got that? Don't need to go through the difference? Okay. Then I guess we'll leave it. So, he views almost all knowledge as insufficient and subjective. Each person can only have their own knowledge of their own experiences. They can't know about it as it fundamentally is. And then a quote from him. But we, in actuality, grasp nothing for certain, but what shifts in accordance with the conditions of the body and of the things, atoms, which enter it and press upon it. So we just happen to know the random experiences that we have due to the random combinations of atoms. The atoms are shifting around however they're shifting around, which produces some experiences in our mind, and all we have is that experience. So we didn't have contact with the atoms themselves, they just produce some experience. And there's no way for us to know, just from the experience we have in our minds, what exactly is going on with those atoms. Now, while he is very critical of the senses and their inability to give us accurate information about reality, he does not do away with sense perceptions completely. Without sense perceptions, we would lose our foundation for our basic assumptions of motion and multiplicity. Remember how he starts out his whole theory. He says, in arguing for the void, for example, he says, obviously there's motion in the universe around us, that much is undisputable, which gives us the void. He also says, obviously there's more than one stuff in this universe around us, therefore there's the void. So he is still making reference to empirical knowledge that we gather through our sense perceptions. He's still saying sense perceptions tell us something about the universe, but what it tells us is very, very limited. So he has a quote that captures what he thinks. Miserable mind, you get your evidences from us, the senses, and do you try to overthrow us? The overthrow will be your downfall. So he's mocking people like Parmenides, who tries to logic away all our sense perceptions. He's saying, no, we have to start with sense perceptions to even start reasoning about the universe around us, while at the same time our sense perceptions don't do a great job of communicating information. They at least communicate some information, which is the only way we can get started with our logicking and our reasoning about the universe. So we have to use the senses, but they don't do a great job communicating to us how the world is. Now, his ethics. As with most mechanistic materialists, the good life is found via obtaining pleasure and avoiding pain. When you reduce the universe to just chemicals and motions, just material matter, then all that's really going to matter is how you experience that material matter, and they're either going to be pleasurable experiences or painful experiences. That's how we classify our sensations. All we have are sensations, those are either pleasant or painful. So any ethics based on a mechanistic materialistic view is going to be based in pleasure and pain. That's going to be a common theme throughout philosophy all the time. If you ever come across a philosopher who all they're talking about in their ethics is pleasure and pain, then there's a good chance that you're talking about a mechanistic materialist. So, the good life is found by pleasure and avoiding pain. However, it is difficult to put together a coherent view of his ethics, and even harder to reconcile it with determinism. So he's definitely a determinist, but then he talks about his ethics as though people have a choice in their actions and can choose to be one way versus another way. So that's where the inconsistency is hard to reconcile. Later, mechanistic materialists are a lot more consistent than he is. He's just the first one to do it. So the best way for a man to live his life is to have been as cheerful as possible and to have suffered as little as possible. That would be close to his summary of his own ethics. While materialist, he still seems to have a hint of a soul and body dichotomy. We remember the soul-body dichotomy introduced by the Pythagoreans. They viewed the soul as trapped in the body, undergoing some sort of punishment, but as two very separate things. So, while in his atomic view, there didn't seem to be much difference between soul and anything else, except for one's a soul atom, one's not. When he talks about his ethics, it's very hard to not think about soul the way that most people are used to think about soul as something immaterial and not physical. It is right that man should value the soul rather than the body. So this is actually a quote from his, and so you'll see some of the inconsistencies. It is right that man should value the soul rather than the body, for the perfection of soul corrects the inferiority of the body, but physical strength without intelligence does nothing to improve the mind. So if you improve your mind, you can use what you learn to improve your body as well, but if you just improve your body, that does nothing to help improve your mind. So focus on improving your mind, focus on improving your soul, and then the good that comes from that improvement will also improve your body. So a little bit of a 2-for-1 deal there. While pleasure is a criterion for a happy life, he holds that some pleasures are better than others, and that one ought to pursue moral pleasures. So this is where he's inconsistent in his ethics. So he's going to say, our ethics, we should pursue pleasure and then avoid pain, but then he's making notion to some other hierarchy, some other metric that's never made explicit, to call some pleasures better than others. If pleasure is your metric for determining good versus bad, you can't also go and say, but here's some other metric for determining how good the pleasures are. You just have to talk about which one's more pleasurable versus less. He's not doing that. Another way he's inconsistent, again, later philosophers following his same line of reasoning are more consistent. So, quote from him, the cheerful man who is impelled towards works, we gotta read off of this. The cheerful man who is impelled, huh?
Is it too dark? I can turn back on. I thought it was lighter outside. Does that hurt your eyes?
Yeah, kind of. But also, the more I stare at it, the more blurry it becomes to my eyes.
Yeah.
So, where is it? The cheerful man who is impelled towards works that are just and lawful rejoices by day and by night, and is strong and free from care. But the man who neglects justice and does not do what he ought finds all such things disagreeable when he remembers any of them, and he is afraid and torments himself. So, if you do just things, then you can go about content with yourself, knowing that, hey, you're doing just things, you're doing good things. But if you do those bad things, then on those nights where you reflect on your actions, you're going to think about those bad things that you did, and it's going to torment you because deep down you know that wasn't just. And so somehow he's introducing justice and injustice as also a metric for what you should and shouldn't do. But somewhat inconsistently. Next, happiness does not dwell in flux or in gold. The soul is the dwelling place of the genius, meaning the part of you that can do good and evil. So happiness does not dwell in flux, meaning a flock of sheep, being wealthy in how many animals you have, or gold, physical wealth. But it resides in the soul. One must not respect the opinion of other men more than one's own, nor must one be more ready to do wrong if no one will know. I've hurried off of this. One must not respect the opinion of other men more than one's own, nor must one be more ready to do wrong if no one will know than if all will know. One must respect one's own opinion most, and this must stand as the law of one's soul, preventing one from doing anything improper. You got to come to know for yourself, and you got to respect your own opinion. You can't go about your life relying on the opinions of other people. And you'll notice that he's going to come up with a bunch of nice little quotes that kind of stick around in philosophy in different forms. If you've ever gone through, I don't know, can't remember his name right now anyways. Next, justice is what should be done. Injustice, its opposite. More men become good through effort than by nature. Only fools are shaped by the gifts of chance. So here's a good one, and here's one that's important for his philosophy, in understanding his philosophy. A big part of his philosophy is you should limit your appetites. Maybe I talked about that on the next slide. Maybe I should check before I... Yeah, I do. So we'll cover that here in a second. So the cheerful life is not found in having an abundance, but rather in limiting our desires and focusing on what is possible.
That seems contradictory to what his whole pleasure versus pain philosophy.
He is not consistent in his ethics. Now remember, we don't have his actual works, we just have references to his works. So hard to know what he might have done to reconcile a lot of these things. But those who follow his line of thinking later try to be more consistent, and their arguments get eaten up. Just that ethics, hard to be consistent, and once we get to Plato, he tears up these arguments left and right. The key to true pleasure is moderation. Okay, that probably sums up a good piece of his ethics more than anything else. The key to true pleasure is moderation, and what was the one on the previous slide? Only fools are shaped by the gifts of chance. So combining those two, let's set up an example. Let's say that you're a wealthy person, or you're a person at the time, and through good fortune, you happen to come into a ton of wealth. And so because you come into a ton of wealth, you might think on his philosophy, well, use the wealth to experience more pleasure, so you might go and develop a more expensive diet, assuming that more expensive means somehow it's producing more pleasure. Let's say that the cost of food is proportional to how much pleasure it produces. So you might think, according to his philosophy, okay, now go get a nice expensive diet so you can have the most pleasurable food. This is where Democritus would say, no, 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 don't do that. You're already content with the diet that you're on, a moderate diet. If you go and you start eating this expensive diet, now you have two problems. One, the same way good fortune came along, he gave you money, it could just as easily come along and take that away. And now, it currently doesn't pain you to not have that expensive diet. If you go and develop the habit of eating that expensive diet, when you lose it, okay, now you're going to experience pain. So, don't ever need the expensive food to begin with. Be content with a simple diet. Otherwise, you make yourself subject to, how did he put it? Only fools are shaped by the gifts of chance. Otherwise, you make yourself subject to the gifts of chance. When chance is kind to you, when good fortune is kind to you, then you have pleasure, but once it's unkind to you, now you have pains. No, just live your life so that independent of your fortune, you can always have a good life. So be content with the simple things. And so the key to true pleasure is moderation. I heard someone phrase this, well, one way. He wouldn't say, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. He would say, don't eat, drink, and be merry, lest tomorrow you die. That would be his counter to that. Okay. Another quote of his, one must give the highest importance to the affairs of the state, that it may be well run. One must not pursue quarrels contrary to right, nor acquire a power contrary to the common good. The well-run state is the greatest protection and contains all in itself. When this is safe, all is safe. When this is destroyed, all is destroyed. Now, he's still a Greek, and remember the focus on the Greek polis, the Greek state. All the citizens in a Greek polis contribute to their state, and if you have a good, solid state, you're pretty well protected. And they would also, almost every Greek you talk to would say that you can't really live a good, full, pleasurable life without in some way participating in the politics in your state. So if you live in a good run state, in their mind it's a city state, then you can live a much fuller, better life than if you don't have a state. So there is no life independent of the state, really. It's not much of a human life. And so the best life is with a good state. Justice is what should be done. Injustice is its opposite. I thought we already said that. Those to whom their neighbor's misfortune gives pleasure do not understand that the blows of fate are common to all, and also they lack cause for personal joy. So he's coming at you two ways, saying if you're getting pleasure out of your neighbor's misfortune, you got two problems. Problem number one, misfortune can come on you just as easy as it can come on anyone. It's not their fault they're suffering misfortune. It's just misfortune. Number two, you must be lacking personal joy if this is where you're going for your source of pleasure. You poor thing. All right, so while Democritus' ethics makes no promises, it does, however, list 3 keys to maximizing your chances of living a cheerful life. 1, live in moderation. 2, take personal responsibility for yourself. 3, live a just life. And that's the end of his ethics. And I think that's the end of him. So, Diogenes of Apollonia. Yeah? If you insist. Okay, Diogenes of Apollonia. Apollonia is right there. He's going to be the last of the Atomists. Now, this is everything on him, so don't worry. He agreed with Anaxagoras that air was the one stuff and that all things were produced through its rarefaction and condensation. The only thing he added to that theory, so he has an atomic theory. The atomic theory is that air is atoms and that those atoms compose everything. But he endowed the air with Anaxagoras' mind or intelligence. That's the only contribution he made. I completely skipped him over, but the author put him in there. So in case you were following in the book, didn't want to completely skip someone. And I wanted to bring him up in case anyone had questions about him. Okay, so next time we will be starting on the Sophists. The Sophists, these are the people that Socrates is going to be directly contending with, arguing with. This is all covered in Plato's dialogues. Plato has a dialogue called Protagoras. Plato has a dialogue called Gorgias. I don't know if he has one called Prodicus, but he shows up in a lot of his dialogues. So now for these people, Plato's going to be our main source of information. So if you want to start getting familiar with any of these people, pick a name, Google their name, dialogue. Chances are Plato has a dialogue with that name. And you can start getting acquainted with them there. We'll start with Protagoras next time and probably do Protagoras and Gorgias.
I think I've read both those. Well, I for sure read Gorgias.
Yeah, I know Protagoras is a fairly lengthy one. It's probably like a 3-hour read.
Oh.
I can't remember how big Gorgias is. It's been a while since I read it. But most of his dialogues aren't that bad. I would say the majority of them can be read in 3 hours or less. The big one, by the way, if you want to start looking ahead for Plato, is the Republic. He's nice because he has one dialogue, the Republic, which gives you his full philosophy, and it's in a very consumable form because it's just a dialogue. It's kind of like you're reading a play. You're just reading a conversation taking place. So he's really nice that way. And he introduced a lot of the Sophists and a lot of the Sophist arguments in his dialogue, so you can get familiar with a lot of these people reading his dialogues. That's where I personally get a lot of my information for these people, is just from those dialogues. So, well, actually, we will go briefly over the Protagoras. I'm not sure about the Gorgias yet. I'm not done with those. But for sure, we will be talking about this dialogue if you want to read it, just because it gives a lot of good information about Protagoras, a lot of good information about what's going on with Socrates and the Sophists, and a lot of good information about Plato. So it's a good getting 3-in-1 type dialogue. So that's what we'll do next week.
What are your other Sophists? Just a list of people or what?
that's just the outline the author had. That'll probably be edited when we come back. I really want Thrasymachus up here. So we'll definitely touch on what he says. So that's just the outline the author has. And Prodicus has almost nothing. I don't know why you want Prodicus and not Thrasymachus. I'm not sure how we'll continue. We'll for sure do these two. And then I don't know what's happening there yet. Got to still work it out. Any other questions? Okay, so we're not meeting next week. I don't know if you were here for that. We're not meeting next week. We'll be meeting the week after that. Okay, and then the 4th, except for the 5th. All right, cool. And then for those of you who want credit, stay and talk, and let's figure out what we're going to do.